January 17th, 1943. A bitter wind rattled the shutters of a small French village, carrying the distant hum of German trucks along cobblestone streets. Inside a modest home on Rue de Maragnes, a dozen figures crouched in near-total darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and candle wax. Every shallow breath seemed amplified, each scrape of boots above threatening discovery. The tunnel was barely more than a slit beneath the floorboards, a hand-dug vein through soil and clay, shored up with splintered wooden beams. One wrong movement, one misjudged step, and the secret would crumble, swallowing them in the silent wrath of the occupiers above. A mother of three, her hands rough from tending the garden by day, guided the fighters forward, her face pale but resolute. The men and women, young and old, pressed on, hearts hammering, mud coating their clothes. Outside, the German patrols marched past, oblivious. Inside, every heartbeat was a countdown. In this narrow underground passage, hope and fear intertwined. In these few feet of soil, a dozen lives teetered between survival and death. By the winter of 1943, much of northern France had been under German occupation for nearly 3 years. The countryside was a patchwork of surveillance and secrecy. Towns like the one on Rue de Maragnes were quiet by day, their cobblestone streets lined with shuttered windows and the occasional black and white sign proclaiming curfew hours. German soldiers patrolled in pairs, their boots echoing sharply against the streets, their eyes scanning for any hint of dissent. Life for civilians had narrowed to the necessities: rationed food, whispered conversations, and carefully monitored movements. A single misplaced word could betray a neighbor, a family, or a resistance cell. Yet beneath this enforced calm, the pulse of defiance thrived. Small networks of resistance fighters, men and women, old and young, moved like ghosts through towns, villages, and forests, carrying messages, forging documents, and planning escapes. Their missions were dangerous, often improvised, and reliant on civilian support. It was here, in one such quiet village, that a civilian woman, known to neighbors simply as Madame Moreau, undertook an extraordinary task. By day, she tended her modest garden and ran errands under the watchful eyes of the occupiers. By night, she became an architect of survival. Over months, using only hand tools and the barest knowledge of structural stability, she dug a narrow tunnel beneath her home. Clay and soil were painstakingly removed, hidden under floorboards or carried to the garden under the cover of darkness. Every beam placed, every plank nailed, with a silent promise, a hidden path to life if the resistance were discovered. Resistance activity in northern France was not only clandestine, but also incredibly perilous. The Gestapo and Feldgendarmerie conducted frequent raids, interrogations, and random house searches. Entire villages could be punished for the actions of a few, and rumors of executions or deportations spread like wildfire. In this environment, civilians like Madame Moreau were not merely helpers. They were co-conspirators in acts that carried the weight of death. The construction of a tunnel was an audacious endeavor, blending ingenuity, courage, and a profound understanding of risk. One misstep, one structural collapse, could have exposed not only the fighters, but also her entire family. The local resistance cell she aided was composed of individuals from every walk of life: factory workers, teachers, students, and farmers. Many had already survived close calls with German patrols or had been forced into hiding after intelligence leaks. Their numbers were small, but their determination was fierce. The civilian-built tunnel became their lifeline, a concealed artery connecting the world above, patrolled, dangerous, and unpredictable, to a sanctuary that existed only in whispers. Madame Moreau's endeavor was not purely mechanical. It required intimate knowledge of the village. She timed her work around patrol schedules, observed German routines, and calculated which areas could safely serve as cover for soil disposal. Every decision was informed by human observation, intuition, and the unspoken rhythm of occupied life. Even the slightest miscalculation, a patrol walking past at the wrong moment, a neighbor becoming suspicious, could have been fatal. By winter, the tunnel was finished, narrow but functional, stretching beneath her home and opening to a secluded barn outside the village. It was designed for speed, with just enough space for one person at a time, forcing those who used it to crawl, inch by inch, with the earth pressing close around them. The resistance members who would eventually use it were trained to move quietly, to follow whispered instructions, to trust the civilian who had risked everything to build this hidden path. The village above seemed peaceful, but beneath its frozen soil, a tense drama was unfolding. Civilians and fighters alike lived in the shadow of constant surveillance, where a single misstep could trigger a violent response. It was a world defined by courage measured in inches, where ingenuity could tip the balance between life and death. In the coming weeks, this narrow tunnel would become the stage for an extraordinary act of survival. A dozen resistance fighters, cornered and hunted, would place their faith in a civilian's quiet heroism. The soil, the beams, and the careful planning would all be tested in a moment when fear and hope collided. By early January 1943, the village's uneasy calm had begun to fracture. German intelligence units, aided by local informants, had intensified their efforts to root out resistance activity in the region. Patrols had become more frequent, checkpoints stricter, and random inspections more invasive. Families lived under the constant threat that a single word, a dropped letter, or a misread sign could lead to arrest, or worse. The local resistance cell felt the tightening noose acutely. Their operations, once cautious but manageable, were now a matter of survival. The tunnel beneath Madame Moreau's home had been conceived precisely to counter this growing threat. Its existence was known to only a handful of trusted individuals, and the plan for its use was as simple as it was risky. Should a raid occur, the fighters could slip into the tunnel and emerge beyond the village, hidden from German eyes. It was an escape route born of necessity, yet its construction demanded extraordinary foresight. Every inch of soil removed, every supporting plank installed, had to withstand not only the weight of earth, but also the psychological weight of those who might one day rely on it to live. As the weeks passed, the pressure on the resistance cell escalated. A factory worker carrying clandestine messages was detained briefly at a checkpoint. A student courier narrowly avoided capture while returning from a neighboring town. Each close call sent ripples through the network, heightening the urgency of finding safe havens. The tunnel was no longer just a precaution. It became a strategic lifeline. Every member understood that when the moment came, they would have to rely entirely on its secrecy, on the careful engineering of a civilian, and on the discipline instilled through months of practice. The tunnel's design reflected an intimate understanding of both human and enemy behavior. Madame Moreau had studied the routines of German patrols, noting the precise times when streets were empty and guards shifted. She had calculated how quickly resistance members could move through the cramped passage, and she had prepared contingencies for collapse or obstruction. The soil above was firm, the exit concealed behind stacked crates in a barn, and every plank reinforced the structure's integrity. Yet even with meticulous planning, the tunnel's success depended entirely on human judgment and nerves of steel. The fighters themselves were aware of the stakes. Many had narrowly survived arrests in nearby towns or the collapse of less prepared operations. They had learned to move silently, to trust in planning, and to suppress panic in moments of extreme danger. The tunnel would test every skill they had honed: physical endurance, mental resilience, and unshakable faith in their civilian ally. For them, it was not merely a route to safety, but a testament to the collaborative courage that defined resistance life under occupation. Meanwhile, the occupiers' presence continued to grow more oppressive. The local Gestapo had intensified interrogations, seeking to dismantle the resistance's networks. Random house searches became more invasive, and even loyal neighbors were questioned about unusual activity. Children and the elderly lived in fear that a casual remark could lead to betrayal. In this climate, the tunnel was more than just a physical structure. It was a shield against the psychological domination imposed by the occupiers. It offered not just a route to escape, but a measure of control over life and death in a world where freedom was systematically stripped away. As the winter deepened, tensions reached a peak. Snow muffled footsteps, but also made every disturbance more visible. The resistance cell faced the very real possibility of simultaneous raids, requiring rapid mobilization and absolute trust in one another. It was in these conditions, with German forces encroaching and patrols tightening like a vice, that the tunnel would finally prove its worth. Every plank, every inch of clay, and every careful measurement would be tested against the unforgiving realities of war. The stage was set. Above ground, the village remained deceptively calm, its streets empty save for the occasional patrolling soldier. Below, in a narrow, dark tunnel, hope and fear coexisted in equal measure. The fighters' lives rested in the hands of one civilian who had chosen courage over safety, ingenuity over simplicity, and secrecy over recognition. The next chapter of this story would explore the different perspectives, human, tactical, technological, and moral, that converged on this single desperate moment. From the claustrophobic crawl beneath the earth to the calculations of enemy behavior, every angle revealed a layer of bravery, strategy, and human endurance. The human element of the tunnel escape is at once the most immediate and the most profound. Inside the narrow passage, fear and determination intertwined with every heartbeat. The fighters, men and women of varying ages and backgrounds, were united by a single, urgent purpose: survival. For many, this was not their first brush with death. Some had witnessed friends captured during minor raids. Others had narrowly avoided Gestapo roundups in neighboring villages. Yet here, beneath the cold soil, the stakes felt even higher. Madame Moreau, the civilian who had designed the tunnel, was central to this human narrative. Her courage was quiet but resolute, a steady presence in a world ruled by fear. She had spent months working in secrecy, knowing that discovery would mean certain death, not only for herself, but for the dozen fighters who now relied on her. Each step she guided, each whispered instruction she gave, carried weight. The human connection, the trust between civilian and fighter, was what transformed a hole in the ground into a lifeline. Physical strain compounded psychological tension. Crawling through the tunnel required endurance, careful attention, and complete silence. Fingers scraped against rough beams, mud clung to clothing, and air was heavy with the scent of earth. Every sound from above, a footstep, a creak in the floorboards, magnified their anxiety. In these moments, courage was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was a quiet, deliberate defiance of fear, a commitment to press forward despite uncertainty. The human angle also reveals the bonds formed under pressure. A whispered word of reassurance, a helping hand when someone stumbled, a shared glance of understanding. All became lifelines of morale. The tunnel was more than a physical escape. It was a conduit for solidarity, a test of humanity in the face of relentless oppression. Each fighter emerged not only physically intact, but psychologically reinforced, having confronted the terror of imminent capture and survived together. From a tactical perspective, the tunnel was a masterstroke of resistance strategy. Occupied towns were dangerous for organized groups. German patrols monitored streets. Intelligence networks sought to uncover collaborators, and random inspections were frequent. Escape routes had to be concealed, predictable only to those who knew them intimately, and rapid enough to avoid interception. The tunnel met all these criteria. Its entrance, hidden beneath the floorboards of Madame Moreau's home, was invisible to casual observation. The exit, concealed in a barn outside the village, allowed fighters to emerge in relative safety, away from the predictable paths of German patrols. Every detail was meticulously planned. The crawl space was narrow enough to discourage unwanted entry, the soil compacted to avoid collapse, and beams reinforced to withstand sudden stress. Timing was critical. The resistance monitored patrol routines, calculating moments of vulnerability when guards were distracted or distant. The tunnel enabled coordinated movements under cover of darkness, reducing exposure above ground. Even in the event of an unexpected patrol, the tunnel provided alternative options for retreat, demonstrating a tactical flexibility rarely seen in improvised civilian-led operations. Moreover, the tunnel allowed the resistance to maintain operational integrity. Fighters could carry sensitive documents, weapons, and messages without the risk of immediate detection. In a landscape dominated by German intelligence and the constant threat of betrayal, this hidden pathway was a decisive advantage, small in scale, but monumental in impact. Though crude in comparison to formal military engineering, the tunnel's construction showcased remarkable ingenuity. With only basic hand tools and knowledge gleaned from observation and experience, Madame Moreau created a structure that could support the weight of the earth above, accommodate multiple users, and remain concealed for months. The tunnel relied on simple physics. Wooden beams countered lateral pressure. Soil was compacted in layers to prevent collapse, and ventilation was carefully managed to prevent suffocation. Every element reflected a civilian's practical understanding of construction under extreme constraints. She had no access to professional resources, yet her solution addressed structural integrity, concealment, and usability simultaneously. This technological ingenuity also intersected with risk management. Beams were placed to reduce noise, soil removed at specific times to avoid detection, and the entrance carefully camouflaged with household debris. The tunnel was a synthesis of necessity and skill, a civilian-engineered apparatus capable of defying the deadly precision of a military occupation. Leadership within the resistance was not about rank or authority. It was measured in judgment, courage, and the ability to make life or death decisions under pressure. The civilian tunnel posed unique challenges that required careful coordination. Madame Moreau, though not a military leader, effectively assumed a command role. She determined when and how the tunnel would be used, directed the movement of fighters, and maintained discipline during moments of extreme stress. Her leadership was characterized by meticulous planning and calm decisiveness. In the weeks leading up to the escape, she monitored patrols, coordinated schedules with the fighters, and anticipated contingencies. A single misstep could have jeopardized the entire operation, yet she maintained composure, ensuring each individual understood their role. Leadership here was silent but pervasive. It relied on trust, authority earned through competence, and the moral clarity of someone willing to risk everything for the survival of others. Within the resistance cell itself, fighters also exhibited distributed leadership. Experienced members guided newcomers, enforced security protocols, and provided emotional support. The tunnel amplified the need for this shared leadership. It demanded coordination, patience, and mutual reliance, proving that effective command in such a high-stakes environment required both courage and collaboration. To understand the stakes of the tunnel escape, one must see it through the eyes of the occupying forces. German patrols, intelligence units, and local collaborators sought to maintain total control. Any sign of organized resistance was met with swift and often brutal retribution. For the occupiers, the village above Madame Moreau's home was ordinary, quiet, compliant, and orderly. Yet beneath the soil, their authority was being quietly subverted. German operations were systematic. Patrols followed predictable patterns. Checkpoints monitored movement, and informants scoured neighborhoods for suspicious activity. The tunnel represented a blind spot in this system, a hidden threat imperceptible from above. The occupiers' success relied on visibility, predictability, and intimidation. In contrast, the resistance's reliance on secrecy and unconventional methods turned the village into a deceptive tableau, masking extraordinary acts of survival under a veneer of ordinary life. From the enemy's perspective, every raid could have uncovered the escape route. Even minor disruptions, such as a neighbor noticing unusual activity, could have triggered inspections. The tunnel was a calculated gamble. invisible yet real. It challenged the occupiers' assumptions about control and underscored the limits of their surveillance, revealing that courage and ingenuity could defy even the most disciplined force. The moral dimension of the tunnel is as compelling as its tactical brilliance. The operation was predicated on risk, not just for the fighters but for the civilian who built it. Madame Moreau's choice to construct and maintain the tunnel reflected an ethical calculus. The imperative to protect human life outweighed the instinct for personal safety. Each plank she hammered, each inch of earth she removed, was an act of moral courage. For the resistance fighters, the moral stakes were equally high. They relied on a civilian's bravery, understanding that any mistake could result in severe repercussions for the village. Every decision, from timing movements to managing noise, carried ethical weight. Survival was intertwined with responsibility. The lives of friends, family, and even strangers depended on their discipline and courage. This moral angle also extends to the broader context of occupied Europe. In a society where obedience was enforced and defiance punished, small acts of conscience, building tunnels, hiding fugitives, or smuggling messages, were profound assertions of humanity. The tunnel symbolizes a choice to act ethically in the face of oppression, to protect life when the world itself seemed bent on destruction. January 17th, 1943, 2:30 a.m. The village was silent under a pale moon, its cobblestones glinting with frost. Above ground, German patrols moved with their usual precision, boots clicking, flashlights scanning the streets. Inside Madame Moreau's home, the dozen resistance fighters pressed themselves against the damp walls of the tunnel entrance. Every breath seemed to echo louder than it should, every heartbeat a drum of impending danger. The order had come from the cell leader. A patrol had been tipped off to suspicious activity in a nearby sector. They would arrive at Rue de Maragnes within minutes. The fighters, knowing the patrol was imminent, slipped one by one into the narrow passage. Mud clung to their clothes, splintered beams scraped their skin, and the cold pressed against their backs. Silence was absolute. A single sound could betray them to the occupiers above. Madame Moreau guided them, whispering brief instructions. Her calm steadied the group, though her own hands shook slightly as she pressed a plank into place to secure a fragile section of the tunnel. The crawl was slow, methodical. Each fighter measured their movements, sliding on elbows and knees, careful to distribute weight evenly and avoid the loose soil overhead. The air was thick with dust and tension, each inhalation a reminder that they were suspended between life and death. Above, the German patrol approached the house. Footsteps grew louder, and the creak of floorboards signaled their proximity. The first fighter had almost reached the midpoint when the sound of boots paused directly overhead. Time seemed to freeze. A soldier muttered to his companion, and the group pressed themselves flat against the tunnel floor. The claustrophobic space felt smaller than ever, walls pressing in, darkness closing like a fist around them. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then the patrol moved on, oblivious to the hidden passage beneath them. A collective, silent sigh of relief passed through the tunnel. But there was no time to linger. The fighters pressed forward, each movement deliberate, each handhold chosen with care. The tunnel had one exit, a barn on the edge of the village, concealed by stacked crates and shadow. Every second counted. The midway point tested both endurance and nerves. One young fighter, exhausted from the crawl, slipped slightly, scraping against a loose beam. The sound was faint, but enough to halt the group. Madame Moreau reached back, whispering words of reassurance, guiding the fighters' weight until they regained balance. It was a reminder that even in a structure designed for escape, human error could prove deadly. Finally, the first figures emerged into the barn's muted shadows. The cold night air struck their faces, sharp and biting, but they were alive. They paused only briefly, listening for sound from the village before helping the others through. One by one, the dozen fighters surfaced, covered in mud, panting, yet filled with the indescribable relief of survival. Madame Moreau was the last to emerge, ensuring the tunnel remained intact for future use and that no trace betrayed its existence. As the final plank was replaced and the entrance secured, the fighters dispersed into the darkness beyond the barn, guided by prearranged routes to safe houses and sympathetic neighbors. Each step away from the tunnel carried the weight of exhaustion, adrenaline, and gratitude. Above ground, the patrols continued their rounds, unaware of the narrow thread of defiance that had just slipped past them. In those moments, the tunnel ceased to be merely a structure. It became a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and trust. Every beam, every inch of earth, and every careful calculation had been validated under extreme pressure. The escape had tested not just the physical resilience of those involved, but the psychological endurance of a community under occupation. Even as dawn approached, painting the frost-covered rooftops with pale light, the tension lingered. The fighters knew that German patrols would continue, that the occupation's threat remained, and that the tunnel could be discovered at any time. Yet for now, survival had been secured. A dozen lives, once vulnerable, had been preserved by the quiet heroism of one civilian and the disciplined courage of those who relied upon her creation. The successful escape marked a turning point, not just for the fighters, but for the local resistance. It demonstrated the power of preparation, trust, and ingenuity against overwhelming odds. The tunnel, born of necessity and constructed in secret, had fulfilled its purpose. But the story was not yet complete. The aftermath of the escape would reveal the broader consequences of this daring act, the impact on the village, and the subtle ripple it sent through the network of resistance across occupied France. The night air was still, but danger had not dissipated. As the dozen fighters slipped from the barn into the surrounding fields, the reality of their situation pressed upon them. Frost-crusted grass cut through thin clothing, and every shadow seemed to harbor the thread of discovery. The escape was not complete until each member reached a secure location. Routes had been planned meticulously. Some would follow narrow forest paths. Others would vanish in a sympathetic neighbor's barns. But even the best-laid plans could falter under the unpredictability of occupied territory. Moments after the last fighter left the tunnel, a German patrol veered toward the barn. The crates concealing the exit were indistinct in the dim light, and the soldiers paused, sweeping the area with flashlights. The flicker of beams passed inches from the hidden entrance. Inside, the earth above the tunnel remained undisturbed, but the tension was palpable. A single misstep, a moved crate, a shifted footprint, could reveal what had just transpired. Every fighter, even those safely on their separate paths, understood the narrow margin between survival and capture. One young courier, exhausted and shivering, took a wrong turn along a frozen lane, almost running into a pair of German soldiers conducting a routine check. Instinct and training saved her. She flattened against a hedge, holding her breath as the patrol passed. Nearby, others were forced to wait in concealed positions, the minutes stretching unbearably. The tunnel had delivered them out of immediate danger, but the final leg of their journey demanded nerves equal to those tested underground. Madame Moreau lingered until she was certain the exit was clear, then quickly secured the tunnel entrance. Each plank was replaced, soil reset, and debris meticulously rearranged. The structure would remain viable for future operations, but at that moment, it was a silent monument to the lives it had saved. Her face, streaked with dirt and shadowed by exhaustion, bore the weight of the night's events. She had risked everything and emerged unscathed, yet she knew the occupiers' search would continue, and that any error could be fatal. By the first light of dawn, the fighters regrouped in safe houses scattered across the countryside. Mud-stained and weary, they shared a quiet camaraderie forged in the crucible of the tunnel. Words were few. Eyes, gestures, and occasional nods carried the acknowledgement of what had just been achieved. Every individual carried with them the knowledge that their lives had depended on the ingenuity and bravery of a civilian who had chosen to act when inaction was safer. The immediate consequences of the night were subtle but profound. German patrols remained unaware of the escape, and the tunnel's existence continued to elude detection. The resistance cell retained operational capability, morale bolstered by the survival of every member. Yet the experience also left an indelible mark on those involved. The psychological strain, the intimate encounter with fear, and the sheer physical exertion of crawling through the narrow, cold passage left scars that would linger long after the night ended. Within the village, life carried on as if nothing had happened. Windows remained shuttered, streets were cleared, and patrols moved in their usual routines. To the German occupiers, the quiet streets symbolized order and control. Beneath the surface, however, the events of that night had exposed vulnerabilities. A civilian-led operation had subverted their surveillance, demonstrating that even a disciplined occupying force could be outmaneuvered through preparation, courage, and intimate local knowledge. The tunnel, once a silent project of necessity, had been tested under the harshest conditions. Its success validated months of labor, every calculation, every reinforced beam, and every moment of secrecy. The fighter survival was a triumph of human ingenuity over oppression, courage over fear, and strategy over brute force. It was a fleeting victory, yet one that would resonate far beyond the frost-covered fields of the village. Even as the adrenaline faded and fatigue set in, the implications of the escape were clear. The local resistance had survived a potentially devastating raid. Civilians had proven their critical role in the network, and the occupiers, unaware of the narrow passage beneath their very feet, remained oblivious to the defiance growing in the shadows of their control. The night had ended, but the story, the human, tactical, and moral consequences, was only beginning to unfold. The daring escape through Madame Moreau's tunnel set the stage for the aftermath, with the lives saved, the reactions of the occupiers, and the long-term impact on the resistance would be examined in full. Dawn arrived without ceremony. A pale winter light settled over the village, revealing nothing unusual. No broken doors, no overturned furniture, no visible signs of panic. To an outside observer, it was another quiet morning in occupied France. But beneath that surface calm, the escape of the previous night had already begun to alter lives. The resistance fighters lay hidden in safe houses scattered across farms and outlying hamlets. Some slept in barns, wrapped in borrowed coats. Others sat awake, replaying every sound, every breath taken inside the tunnel. Their bodies bore the marks of the escape, scraped hands, bruised knees, aching muscles, but they were alive. In occupied Europe, survival itself was a victory. For the resistance cell, the immediate consequence was continuity. No arrests followed that morning. No names were called out over loudspeakers. No bodies were displayed as warnings. The network remained intact, its couriers, organizers, and planners still free to operate. In practical terms, this meant messages continued to flow, intelligence could still be gathered, and preparations for future sabotage or coordination with Allied forces could proceed. German forces, meanwhile, sensed that something had slipped through their grasp. Patrols intensified over the following days. Checkpoints were reinforced. Houses were searched with greater frequency, and villagers were questioned about strangers, unusual noises, or nighttime activity. The raid that had prompted the escape had failed to yield results, and failure rarely led to restraint. It led to pressure. Madame Moreau felt this pressure acutely. Each knock on the door tightened her chest. Each soldier's glance lingered too long. Yet her home revealed nothing. The floorboards lay undisturbed. The tunnel entrance remained invisible. Her children went about their routines, coached carefully on what not to say. The success of the escape demanded absolute normalcy afterward. Survival now depended on restraint rather than action. Within the village, fear and relief coexisted uneasily. Some residents sensed that something significant had occurred. Others preferred not to know. Silence became a form of protection. In occupied communities, ignorance was often deliberate, a shield against forced complicity. The fewer questions asked, the safer everyone remained. For the fighters, the psychological aftermath proved as challenging as the physical escape. Several struggled with lingering claustrophobia. Others replayed moments where discovery had seemed inevitable. These were not soldiers trained in formal armies. They were civilians turned fighters, carrying the weight of survival alongside the burden of knowing how close they had come to execution or deportation. Yet morale rose. The tunnel had worked. A civilian-built structure, designed without blueprints or professional tools, had defeated one of the most aggressive occupation regimes in Europe. Word of the escape traveled quietly through resistance channels, stripped of names and locations, but rich in implication. It reinforced a crucial truth. The occupiers were not omniscient. Their control had limits. German reports from the region noted suspected resistance movement, but cited no arrests. This absence of results frustrated commanders and emboldened resistance leaders. The tunnel had not merely saved lives, it had preserved momentum. In underground warfare, continuity mattered more than spectacle. Madame Moreau returned to her routines. She tended her garden. She queued for rations. She spoke politely when spoken to. But beneath her home, the tunnel remained, sealed and silent, its existence now bound to a night that had reshaped the fate of a dozen people. The escape did not end the danger. It transformed it. German suspicion intensified, and the cost of any future mistake increased. Yet the resistance had gained something invaluable, proof that preparation, discipline, and civilian courage could outlast fear. And as the weeks passed, the impact of that single night began to extend beyond the village itself, influencing decisions, strategies, and morale across the local resistance network. In the months that followed, the escape through the tunnel quietly reshaped the resistance landscape of the region. The fighters who had survived that January night did not return to their former routines unchanged. Their experience altered how operations were planned, how risks were calculated, and how civilians were integrated into resistance strategy. What had once been considered extraordinary, deep civilian involvement in covert infrastructure, became recognized as essential. The tunnel itself was used sparingly after the escape. Its value lay not in frequent use, but in its continued secrecy. Resistance leaders understood that repetition invited discovery. Instead, the tunnel became a contingency, a silent guarantee that if another cell were cornered, survival was possible. Its existence influenced planning decisions well beyond the village, encouraging similar escape concepts elsewhere, though few were ever constructed with the same success. German occupation forces never officially identified the tunnel. Records from the period indicate heightened suspicion and several inconclusive investigations, but no direct evidence emerged. This absence frustrated German intelligence units and contributed to a growing sense of uncertainty within local command structures. They controlled roads, documents, and weapons, but they could not fully control the hidden geography beneath civilian homes. For Madame Moreau, the aftermath was defined by endurance rather than recognition. She received no medals, no public acknowledgement, and no formal protection. Her reward was survival, hers and that of the fighters she had saved. Like many civilian resistors, her contribution existed only in fragments of testimony, whispered accounts, and later historical reconstruction. This anonymity was both a shield and a burden, preserving her safety while erasing her courage from immediate memory. The resistance fighters dispersed as the war progressed. Some joined larger networks. Others were eventually captured in unrelated operations. A few survived to see liberation. What bound them permanently was the shared memory of the tunnel, the darkness, the silence, the fear held in check by discipline. In post-war recollections, those moments resurfaced with startling clarity, often described not as heroism, but as necessity. When Allied forces advanced through the region in 1944, the village emerged largely intact. Liberation brought celebration, but also reckoning. Stories surfaced slowly. The tunnel was eventually revealed, its narrow dimensions and rough beams standing in stark contrast to the lives it had preserved. To later observers, It appeared almost impossibly small, a reminder that survival in wartime often depended on spaces measured in inches. Historians examining civilian resistance have since pointed to such tunnels as evidence of how ordinary people adapted to extraordinary circumstances. These were not acts driven by ideology alone, but by proximity, by knowing who lived next door, who was at risk, and who might be saved. The tunnel beneath Madame Moreau's home exemplified this localized courage, grounded not in abstraction, but in human connection. The long-term impact of the escape extended beyond tactical lessons. It reinforced a moral reality that defined occupied Europe. Resistance was not only fought with weapons, but with patience, labor, secrecy, and trust. Civilians were not peripheral to the struggle. They were its foundation. As time passed, the physical tunnel deteriorated. Wood rotted. Soil settled. Eventually, it collapsed into the earth from which it had been carved. But significance endured. It remained a testament to what could be achieved when fear was met with resolve, when ordinary lives intersected with history's most dangerous demands. The story of the tunnel does not end with liberation or victory. Its meaning lies in what it reveals about human behavior under occupation, about the quiet decisions that determine whether others live or die. The tunnel beneath Madame Moreau's home no longer exists. The soil has settled. The wood has returned to earth. Nothing in the village today reveals that, for one winter night in 1943, the fate of a dozen lives rested just beneath its floorboards. Yet absence does not erase significance. This story endures because it reflects a truth about war that rarely appears in official reports. Survival is often decided not by grand strategy or overwhelming force, but by quiet preparation and moral resolve. The tunnel was not built to make history. It was built to save lives. In doing so, it became a small but profound act of defiance against a system designed to erase individuality and choice. Madame Moreau was not a soldier. She wore no uniform and carried no weapon. Her resistance took the form of labor, patience, and silence. These qualities rarely earn monuments, yet they sustained a resistance as surely as any battlefield victory. In occupied Europe, courage was measured not only by action, but by restraint, by the ability to live normally while hiding extraordinary risk beneath one's feet. For the fighters who crawled through that narrow passage, the tunnel became a boundary between fear and possibility. On one side lay capture, interrogation, and death. On the other, a chance, fragile, uncertain but real. That chance was created by a civilian who chose to act when inaction was safer. History often remembers wars through their loudest moments. Battles, bombardments, liberation parades. But beneath those events lies a quieter layer of human experience. Cellars, attics, barns, and tunnels. Spaces where decisions were made in whispers and survival depended on trust. The tunnel's legacy is not its construction, but its meaning. It reminds us that even under occupation, agency survives. That ordinary people, faced with extraordinary danger, can shape outcomes far beyond their scale. And that in the darkest conditions, humanity does not disappear. It adapts. In the end, the tunnel did not change the course of the war. But for 12 people, it changed everything. And in that narrow stretch of earth, history passed not with thunder, but with breath held in silence.